So I move to the part 3, historical roots, some political experience. So no matter how many mistakes were made by the Chinese Communist Party in theory and in practice, China's early anti-imperialism and in the last years its debates with Soviet Union were the basic reasons for its completion of sovereignty. On these questions, there can be no judgment passed from the vantage of only one or the other episode. Through the process of the debates with Soviet Union, China was able to escape from the Suzerain control of the Soviet Party and thereby escape as well from the control of the Soviet state in order to establish its own independent model. In reality, the gradual hollowing out of the bipolar system during the Cold War was connected to China's particular critique and the struggle with it. So many people believe that because of the Cultural Revolution, because of the Great Leap Forward, big failures, a lot of the crises and a lot of tragedies happened during this period. And the people use the term, quite popular, authoritarian regime, to describe the nature of political system in China. I'm not trying to explain about this term in this context, but I try to ask all of us whether or not in this system is there any self-corrective mechanism in these political systems? Because we say that the democracy is a mechanism. You can correct the mistakes, right? Through the election. Next election will change the policy. Last policy was wrong, so you can peacefully correct the whole mistakes. Is there any kind of the similar mechanism in China? So totally different political systems. But my question is that is there any kind of these kind of the systems? I think if you look at these long history, historically speaking, you found the Communist Party and the Chinese government made so many adjustments, both politically and economically and socially. They made a lot of the adjustments, though even the new adjustments not necessarily correct. Then keep that kind of the process, and the next stage they will correct it. So, in the political tradition, in the traditional context, Communist Party used the term so-called line struggle. 路线斗争 in Chinese is a line struggle. Most of us understand the line struggle as a power struggle. But it's not only, of course it's a power struggle, because without the democratic mechanism within the party, sometimes the line struggle could be quite harsh. Liu Shaoqi and even Deng Xiaoping himself during the Cultural Revolution were thrown down and suffered a lot and so on and so forth. However, it was a line struggle, not only the power struggle, which means that trying to shift the old line to the new line, and then from new line to the new line. So these were a kind of mechanism to make the change from within the system. Otherwise, it's very difficult to understand the reform. What's the reform? Reform is not forced by others. Reform is started from within. Certain kind of within the system, the kind of the system try to make the change. Though those change were not necessarily smooth, sometimes violent. But in any case, still, a kind of the self-corrective mechanism existed in these systems. So, what kind of mechanism in those self-corrective mechanisms? I give you some examples. One example is about the practice, right? Experiments. We know that Deng Xiaoping had a very famous slogan, touching upon the stone to cross, feeling the stone to cross the river, right? It's about the practice. It showed that no existing model for Chinese reform. But if you are familiar with the documents in the 20th century Chinese Revolution, you found that this slogan came from Mao on practice during the wartime. He said that no existing model for the revolution. So we need only from practice to practice. These were the basic doctrine for the communist revolution in China at that time. So these were practice as a mechanism to correct some doctrines we followed earlier. We changed the line. So these are experiments. It's kind of the experimentalism. You can argue that is a kind of the pragmatism. Second, I think it's not only the practice, but theoretical debate is very much important, because the line struggle is always happened in the theoretical ways to some extent. The debate between the Communist Party, Chinese Communist Party, and the Soviet Union, at the beginning, it was a theoretical debate. Basically, you know that in the Chinese reform, the basic theories, the law of value, argued by very famous economist Sun Yefang, another quite famous, they were thought as a thinker of Chinese reform. The early years, it was Gu Zhun. He talked about the value, the issue of value, commodity and the value, and the law of value, and so on and so forth. This is a classical category from the classical, the political economy. But most of people forget this issue was not raised only in the beginning of Chinese reform. At the beginning, it was in the 1950s, during the debate between China and the Soviet Union. Gu Zhun, in 1956, published very famous paper on value. Sun Yefang, in 1959, published a paper on the law of value to talk about why in a socialist country we still need the commodity economy. The law of value was still useful. So these were the end of the 1950s. So in the mid-70s, it revived when Deng Xiaoping took power. And then the second revival after Deng Xiaoping came back again after the 1979. That became the starting point of the Chinese reform. So theoretical debate paved the way for Chinese reform. But this was not the sudden incident. You can find some roots in the early stages. So most of the people forget about these issues. And the Cultural Revolution. A lot of people know that the Cultural Revolution, a lot of the tragedies happened. But you know that in Eastern European countries, there was no such thing as a Cultural Revolution. And during the Cultural Revolution, together with Deng Xiaoping and the top leaders and different levels, all those cadres were sent to the countryside, the factories, and so on and so forth. They suffered a lot. But after the Cultural Revolution, when they went back to their positions, they actually were able to make the responses to the demands of the lower social strata. We know that a lot of explanations about the collapse of Eastern European countries is about the bureaucratization. They're so stubborn, the officials. they were not able to make the responses to the demands of the social strata. But because of this long process, so it's not necessarily mean that you are, when we explain it historically, not necessarily mean that we are for Cultural Revolution. It's a sequence or the consequence. Not necessarily you are designed to be that. But these issues, I think it's made the whole state structure more flexible. So that's why that's after the Cultural Revolution, new Chinese government led by Deng Xiaoping able to launch the Chinese reform. Otherwise, it's very difficult. So without the Cultural Revolution and its negation, it's difficult to imagine there would be a Chinese reform in such scale.